You need to leave. Now. This is my property, and you have zero authority here." The woman's face turned crimson as she jabbed her finger toward the road. "I am Claire Thornton, and in Meadowbrook Estates. What I say goes. Hi, I'm Derek Hayes, and I'm here to share what happened when I bought 43 acres of Texas grassland that one woman believed she owned. Stay with me, because this gets wild." The August heat was suffocating when I heard tires crunching gravel. I'd been hammering posts into baked earth for 4 hours. Shirt soaked through. Sawdust coating my arms. I'd owned this land exactly 5 days. 43 acres of neglected pasture and dilapidated buildings, purchased at county auction for $119,000. After 21 months grieving my business partner Thomas, who died in a crane collapse, this farm represented my chance to rebuild. Then that white Escalade came charging down my access road like a heat-seeking missile, dust billowing behind it. The vehicle skidded sideways 20 feet from where I stood. Out stepped a woman who looked like she'd walked off a country club brochure. Late 50s. Platinum hair in a tight bun. Wearing an ivory pantsuit completely inappropriate for rural Texas. Her eyes locked onto mine with Arctic intensity despite the 95-degree temperature. She marched straight toward me. Stilettos somehow stable on uneven ground. Stopping where my incomplete fence line began. Her voice could have cut steel. "Stop immediately." I wiped sweat from my face. "Excuse me." "You heard me perfectly. Stop what you're doing right now." 22 years as a structural engineer taught me to recognize authentic authority versus manufactured control. This woman was manufacturing. I pulled my deed from my back pocket. "I'm Derek Hayes. I purchased this property 5 days ago at county auction with certified funds. Here's my deed." I extended the document. She didn't glance at it. Instead, she smiled, and it held zero warmth. "I know exactly who you are. Mr. Hayes. I know what you paid and when you paid it. My name is Claire Thornton. I'm president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. And your little piece of paper means absolutely nothing here." She gestured at my fence posts. "You don't have permission to build anything on this land." I kept my expression neutral. "This property isn't part of your HOA. I verified the records." Her smile widened. "Did you verify who controls every utility and access point to this parcel?" "Water? Electricity. The only road in?" She stepped closer. "Expensive perfume mixed with something sharper. Something like Triumph. Everything flows through land I control. You want anything from the outside world, you go through me." She let that hang in the scorching air. The previous owner learned that lesson the hard way. George Hartwell spent 5 years fighting me. He died alone in that farmhouse, and not one person attended his funeral. Is that the future you're choosing? I looked past her at the Escalade, at the dust settling like fog, at the spotless white paint. Then back at my fence posts, at the land stretching toward the old farmhouse and the barn with the sagging roof. I thought about George Hartwell, a name I'd only seen on legal documents. I thought about how Claire said his name, like she was proud of what happened. Somewhere in my memory, a line from the auction paperwork surfaced. Parcel, not subject to any HOA covenant or restriction. I hadn't thought it mattered then. Now I wondered if it mattered more than anything. "I'll take my chances," I said quietly. Claire tilted her head, studying me like an interesting specimen. "Brave?" "Stupid, but brave." She turned and walked back to her SUV. Just before climbing in, she looked back. "Check your mail tomorrow. Mr. Hayes. You'll find something interesting." She disappeared in another dust cloud. I stood there for a long moment, mallet forgotten on the ground. Then I walked to the farmhouse and dug through documents from the county office. 20 minutes of searching. Buried in the property survey appendix, I found it. A stop work notification filed with the county 4 days before the auction even occurred. Someone tried to block construction on this land before I knew it existed. The filing was anonymous, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Claire Thornton knew I was coming before I knew myself. As I sat in fading light, I noticed something I'd missed during my initial walkthrough: an old security camera mounted on a wooden post near the barn. Lens pointed directly where I'd been working. The red light on its base was dark, but the solar panel attached looked newer than everything else on the property. I made a mental note to check it later. Then I looked at the cardboard box in the living room corner, labeled G. Hartwell, personal, that I'd found in the barn. George Hartwell fought Claire for 5 years. He lost. But maybe he left something behind that could change everything. Next morning, I drove 52 minutes to the county recorder's office in downtown Riverside. The building was a squat concrete structure from the 60s, designed to intimidate. I pushed through glass doors at exactly 9 a.m., clutching my deed, property survey, and the anonymous stop work notification. The clerk behind the counter was a slim woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched on her nose. Something flickered across her face when I mentioned the Hartwell property. "You're the one who bought it at auction," she said slowly. I asked to see complete land records, including any covenants, easements, or HOA agreements. She disappeared into the back room and returned with a surprisingly thin manila folder. Her voice dropped as she slid documents across the counter. "Your property is not and has never been part of any homeowners association. No covenants. No restrictions beyond standard county zoning." She glanced toward the door. "But permits around here have a way of getting lost when certain people make phone calls." She retreated to her desk before I could ask more. I spent the next hour examining every document, photographing each page with my phone. The records confirmed what I suspected. My 43 acres existed in a legal vacuum as far as the HOA was concerned. George Hartwell purchased the land in 1987, decades before Meadowbrook Estates was developed. When the subdivision went up in 2005, developers tried to incorporate his property into the HOA covenant, but Hartwell refused to sign. The paperwork showed 4 separate attempts to force annexation. All failed. The last attempt was dated 2020, just 18 months before Hartwell died. I made sure documents were clearly legible in my photos. Then I drove home, already composing the phone call I'd make to Marcus Sullivan, one of Dallas's best real estate attorneys and my former college roommate. The first thing I saw when I pulled up to the farmhouse was the damage. My temporary water line, 120 feet of garden hose from the well pump, had been sliced clean through in 4 places. Precise cuts made with something sharp, not animal tears. My cedar fence posts lay scattered across the ground like broken matchsticks. Boot prints pressed deep into soft earth beside them. Fresh tire tracks led from the main road to the fence line and back. The distinctive tread pattern of an expensive SUV. I documented everything with photographs and measurements, checking timestamps on each image. If Claire wanted to play this game, every move she made would be recorded. I was examining the water line when I heard footsteps from the tree line to the east. An old man walked toward me, mid-70s, wearing faded overalls and carrying a bottle of whiskey. He stopped 10 feet away and held up the bottle. "Name's Russell Parker. I live about a mile that way." He nodded toward the scattered fence posts. "Looks like someone already gave you a proper Meadowbrook welcome." I invited him to sit on the porch. Over the next hour, Russell told me things that made my blood run cold. He'd owned 28 acres adjacent to my property for 23 years. When Claire took over as HOA president in 2009, she began a systematic campaign against him. Citations, complaints, threats about his access road. 5 years of that, Russell said. Taking a long pull from the whiskey, my wife developed anxiety so severe she couldn't sleep. Eventually, I sold for 40% what the land was worth. He didn't need to tell me who the buyer was. But George Hartwell never broke. Russell continued, leaning forward, That old man fought her right up until the day he died. He told me once he was building a case, something that would bring the whole system down. Then one morning, they found him in his living room. Heart attack, according to the coroner. Russell looked at the farmhouse behind us. Whatever evidence George was collecting, it's probably still in there. She never got her hands on this place, no matter how hard she tried. That evening, I called Marcus Sullivan. He listened without interrupting as I explained everything. When I finished, his response was direct. No covenant means no authority. You're legally untouchable on that front. But Derek, these people weaponize process. Building permits vanish. Inspections fail for no reason. Utility companies suddenly find problems. I told him about the photographs and tire tracks. Good. Keep that file growing. And if you find whatever Hartwell was working on, call me immediately. After hanging up, I opened the cardboard box from the barn. Inside were stacks of papers, photographs, and financial records. Near the bottom, I found a county planning map with handwritten notes in red ink. One phrase stood out, circled 4 times: power line, check easement, key to everything. I didn't understand what it meant yet, but I added the photograph to my file. At 11:38 p.m., my phone buzzed with an email. The sender address was a random string of numbers. No subject line, just an attachment. I opened it and felt my stomach drop. The image showed me standing in front of the county recorder's office that morning, taken from a vehicle parked across the street. The caption read, "We know where you go. Stop while you still can." I saved the email, forwarded it to Marcus, and walked to the window. The night outside was perfectly still. But somewhere out there, someone had graduated from vandalism to surveillance. This was no longer about a fence. The week that followed was a masterclass in how power really works in small-town Texas. On Monday, I drove to the county planning office for a fence permit. The clerk took my application, glanced at the address, and disappeared for nearly an hour. When she returned, my paperwork came back marked extended review with no timeline and no explanation. On Tuesday, the power company informed me that an easement dispute prevented any electrical connection to my property. The representative couldn't produce documentation of this dispute or name who filed it. On Wednesday, the only building supply company in Riverside canceled my $2,100 lumber order. The yard manager met me at the gate with an apologetic shrug. A call came from the owner. "We're not doing business with you." 3 days. 3 different businesses. The same invisible hand pulling strings. Claire had built a machine, and every lever in Riverside answered to her. Thursday evening, I made the mistake of attending the monthly town hall meeting. I told myself it was reconnaissance, a chance to identify potential allies. What I witnessed was theater. Claire arrived 17 minutes after the meeting began, timing her entrance for maximum effect. Navy blue dress, pearls. The picture of respectable leadership. When she rose during public comment, the room fell silent with a reverence that made my skin crawl. "I want to address a concern many of you have shared privately," she began, her voice warm and measured. "We've worked hard to build something special in Meadowbrook. Our property values, our safety, our way of life. But recently, there have been troubling developments on the outskirts of our community. New arrivals who believe rules don't apply to them." She never said my name. Every head in the room turned to look at me in the back row. I was the outsider now. The threat. The problem to be solved. 16 years of carefully cultivated authority had turned an entire town into her chorus. After the meeting, I stopped at the only diner in town. The moment I walked through the door, a woman gathered her children and moved to a booth across the room. I sat alone at the counter, feeling the weight of stares on my back. The owner of the general store, a heavy-set man named Carl, slid onto the stool beside me and kept his voice low. "What she's doing is wrong. Everyone knows it. But I have a business and a family. I can't be seen on your side. He left a $5 bill for my coffee and walked out. That was the closest thing to kindness I'd receive in Riverside for weeks. Claire hadn't just blocked my permits. She'd made me a pariah in a community I'd never asked to join. Russell Parker came by the farm on Friday afternoon with another bottle of whiskey and an expression caught between resignation and hope. We sat on the porch as the sun began to set. George Hartwell came closest to beating her, Russell said quietly. He spent 4 years building a case. Told me once he'd figured out the key to bringing her down. Russell paused, staring at the horizon. It had something to do with the power lines. He said the whole thing was built on a lie about who controlled the electricity to these properties. But he died before he could use it. I thought about the note in George's papers, the phrase circled in red ink. Power line, check easement, key to everything. George had been onto something. Whatever he discovered about those power lines had scared Claire enough to make his life a living hell. Maybe that same discovery could save mine. That night, Marcus called with advice I didn't want to hear. Derek, this woman has connections everywhere. County commissioners, utility board members, state legislators. You could fight this for years and spend every penny you have. He paused. You could sell and walk away. This isn't the only land in Texas. I looked out the window at the overgrown fields, the sagging barn, the fence line I'd barely started. I thought about George dying alone in this house with his work unfinished. I thought about Russell losing everything. I thought about every family Claire had crushed. No, I said. I'm not going anywhere. There was silence on the line. Then Marcus replied. Then, find whatever George was working on. Because right now, that's your only chance. After the call, I remembered the security camera on the wooden post near the barn. The one with the solar panel that looked newer than everything else on the property. I'd been meaning to check it since the first day. I found a ladder and climbed up to examine the device. The camera was old but functional, and the memory card was nearly full. I connected it to my laptop and started scrolling through weeks of unremarkable footage. Empty fields. Occasional wildlife. Nothing useful. Then I found the recording from 3 nights before I even arrived at the property. Timestamped at 2:41 a.m. A figure in dark clothing moved through the frame, methodical and unhurried. I watched as they cut my water line in 4 precise locations, then kicked over the fence posts. When the figure turned toward the camera, moonlight caught the logo embroidered on their jacket. Thornton Realty, Claire's real estate company. I replayed the footage 4 times to make sure I was seeing correctly. I saved the video to 3 separate locations, my hands trembling slightly as I worked. This wasn't circumstantial evidence or hearsay, or my word against hers. This was footage of a crime in progress committed by someone wearing her company's logo on property she'd been trying to control for years. Marcus had told me to find what George was working on. But George hadn't lived long enough to capture something like this. Claire had gotten sloppy. Or she'd grown so confident in her power that she no longer believed anyone would dare to look. Either way, she'd made a mistake, and I was going to make her pay for it. I closed my laptop and stared out at the darkness beyond the window. Somewhere out there, she was sleeping soundly, certain I'd break like everyone before me. She had no idea what was coming. I sent the security footage to Marcus the next morning with timestamp analysis and screenshots of the Thornton Realty logo. His response came within 90 minutes. This is criminal vandalism. Derek, we could file a police report right now. I considered it. Watching the cursor blink on my screen, the temptation was real. But playing this card too early would be a mistake. Claire had survived 16 years because she knew how to manage small fires. If I hit her with a vandalism charge now, she'd sacrifice the employee in that video and come back twice as hard. I needed the full picture before making my move. Hold off. I typed back. I want the bigger fish. That afternoon, I spread George Hartwell's papers across the kitchen table. The deeper I went, the clearer the picture became. Claire wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was running a sophisticated operation, and my farm sat directly in its path. I found the development proposal buried near the bottom of the stack. Meadowbrook Commercial Plaza, a 320-acre mixed-use project including retail space, office buildings, and a boutique hotel. Projected investment, $47 million. The proposed location extended from the eastern edge of the HOA subdivision westward to encompass 7 privately owned parcels. My 43 acres were marked on the map with a red X. But George had discovered something more damaging than the project itself. Buried in his files was a copy of the developer operating agreement. The company was called Horizon Ridge Partners. I scanned the list of silent partners until one name stopped me cold. CT Holdings, LLC. 17% ownership. I didn't need to look up who owned CT Holdings. The initials told me everything. Claire Thornton had a direct financial stake in the project that required my land. I called Marcus and explained what I'd found. He let out a low whistle. An HOA president using her position to force out landowners for personal profit. That's fraud. Civil conspiracy. Maybe racketeering, depending on how deep it goes? I asked about the power line situation and the so-called easement dispute. Texas Utility Code Section 163.101, landlocked property access. Marcus said, if your parcel can't connect to utilities without crossing someone else's land, the utility company must provide service regardless of easement disputes. The dispute has to be adjudicated by a court before denial is legal. Otherwise, they're violating state law. Something shifted in my chest. Claire had built her empire on a foundation of intimidation, not law. And foundations like that could be cracked. Next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the Public Utility Commission of Texas. I included my deed, the written denial from the power company, and documentation that no court had ever adjudicated any easement dispute. Then I called the power company's legal department. Texas is a one-party consent state, so I recorded every word. The attorney was evasive until I cited the specific code section and asked for documentation of the court filing. His tone changed immediately. This may have been flagged based on correspondence from the local homeowners association, he said carefully, then ended the call. I had what I needed. No legal basis. No court order. Just a phone call from a woman who thought she was untouchable. 4 days later, the Public Utility Commission opened an investigation. Within 3 weeks, the power company sent a letter expressing regret for any confusion and scheduling a connection appointment for 28 days out. Claire's blockade was cracking. She'd controlled access to electricity for years, using it as leverage to break anyone who defied her. But she'd never faced someone who understood regulatory systems. I wasn't just a stubborn farmer. I was an engineer with 22 years of navigating bureaucracy. That same week, I reached out to Amanda Chen, an investigative reporter for the Riverside County Herald. I'd found her byline on several articles about local government corruption. We met at a coffee shop in the next town over, far enough from Meadowbrook that I wouldn't be recognized. Amanda was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and direct. She listened without interrupting as I laid out my situation. When I finished, she set down her coffee cup. HOA horror stories are popular, but they're hard to prove. Most come down to he said, she said. I told her I had more than stories. I told her about George Hartwell's files, the development deal, and Claire's hidden ownership stake. I didn't mention the security footage. That card wasn't ready to play. Amanda's eyes narrowed with interest. If you can document a conflict of interest between an HOA president and a commercial development, that's a real story. Give me what you have, and I'll start digging. I handed her copies of everything except the video and the operating agreement. Those would come later, when the timing was right. Russell stopped by that evening. I showed him the development proposal. His face went pale as he traced the boundary lines with his finger. My 28 acres are inside this zone, he said quietly. She bought my land for 40% its value. Now I know why. He looked up at me with something between rage and grief. She destroyed my family for a strip mall. I told him about the ownership stake, about CT Holdings. Russell's hands trembled as he absorbed the implications. George was right, he whispered. He always said there was money behind it. He just couldn't prove where. I told Russell we were getting close to proving everything. I asked if he'd be willing to testify when the time came. He nodded slowly. I lost my wife because of that woman. My land. My peace. If you give me a chance to look her in the eye and tell a courtroom what she did, I'll take it. That night, at exactly 11:17 p.m., my phone rang. Blocked number. I answered and heard Claire's voice, stripped of the warmth she'd shown at town hall. You think you're clever. Mr. Hayes. Filing complaints. Talking to reporters. She paused. I've run this town for 16 years. You'll get your electricity. Consider it a gift. Her voice dropped, cold and precise. But the power I control has nothing to do with wires. Every person you meet, every business you need, every official who stamps your paperwork, they answer to me. Enjoy your lights. You'll need them to see what's coming. The line went dead. I stood in the darkness of the farmhouse, phone still pressed to my ear. Claire knew about Amanda. She knew about the PUC complaint. She had eyes everywhere. And she wanted me to understand that winning one battle meant nothing in a war she'd been fighting for 16 years. But her voice had carried something I hadn't heard before, an edge of desperation beneath the threats. She wasn't calling to intimidate me. She was calling because she was scared. And scared people make mistakes. I walked to the window and looked out at the empty field stretching toward Meadowbrook. Somewhere in those houses. Claire was already planning her next move. But so was I. And unlike her, I had the law on my side. The attack on my reputation began on a Wednesday morning. I'd driven 3 towns over to pick up supplies from one of the few hardware stores still willing to do business with me. When I returned, Russell was waiting on my porch with an expression I'd never seen before. Part anger, part pity, part fear. You need to see this, he said, holding out his phone. The screen showed a community message board. The headline read, Warning, Convicted Fraudster Living Among Us. Below it was a photograph of my face taken from my old engineering company's website alongside a fabricated mugshot created with photo editing software. The text accused me of running a construction fraud scheme in Dallas, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from elderly homeowners, and fleeing to Riverside to escape justice. None of it was true. Every word was a lie. But within 7 hours, the post had been shared over 350 times and accumulated more than 240 comments calling for my arrest. The harassment started that afternoon. Someone threw garbage over my fence line and left a dead possum on my mailbox with a note that read, Fraudsters get what they deserve. I documented everything, photographing the evidence and logging times and license plates. But I knew this wasn't spontaneous. The post had appeared too perfectly, spread too quickly, targeted too precisely. Claire was escalating, using the entire community as her weapon. I called Marcus and read him the accusation. His response was grim. Textbook defamation. Libel, per se. You could sue, but it'd take years and tens of thousands of dollars. Meanwhile, the damage is done. I thanked him and hung up, staring out at fields that suddenly felt less like a fresh start and more like a prison. The next blow came on Friday. Claire had called an emergency HOA meeting with a single agenda item, community safety concerns regarding adjacent property. I wasn't invited. But Amanda Chen had a contact inside who agreed to record the proceedings. What I heard made my blood boil. Claire delivered a trembling performance about disturbing revelations regarding her new neighbor. She presented fabricated complaint letters from residents claiming I'd trespassed on their property and made threatening remarks. Then came her solution. The HOA would generously offer to purchase my property at fair market value, thereby protecting the community from further harm. Sheriff Dale Morrison was in attendance, and Claire publicly requested that he investigate the fraud allegations. The sheriff said he'd need actual evidence before opening any investigation. But the seed had been planted. The entire room now believed I was a criminal who'd somehow escaped justice. The social isolation was swift and complete. On Sunday, I drove to the small church on the edge of town. The pastor met me at the door with an apologetic expression. "Mr. Hayes, some congregation members have expressed concerns. Perhaps it'd be best if you worshipped elsewhere." I didn't argue. I simply walked back to my truck, feeling eyes burning into my back. By Wednesday, even the gas station attendant refused to make eye contact. I'd become invisible and dangerous at the same time. That night, I called my mother in Florida. She was 84 years old, sharp as ever, and the only family I had left. Something in my voice must have given me away. "Derek, what's wrong?" she asked. "You sound exhausted." I told her I was fine, just busy with the farm. She was quiet for a moment. There's no shame in walking away from a fight you can't win. After I hung up, I sat in the darkness and allowed myself to feel the weight of what was happening. For the first time, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe this wasn't worth it. The knock on my door came at 9:23 p.m. Through the window, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. Middle-aged with graying hair and nervous eyes, looking over her shoulder as if afraid of being followed. I opened the door, and she spoke quickly, barely above a whisper. "My name is Patricia Monroe. I'm on the HOA board. I shouldn't be here, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't say something." She glanced around before continuing. "Everything Claire said about you is a lie. She made us sign those complaint letters without reading them. Told us it was routine paperwork. Half the board didn't know what we were putting our names on. I invited her inside. Over the next hour, Patricia confirmed my worst suspicions and opened doors I hadn't known existed. Claire had been manipulating the HOA board for years. Most members simply did what they were told. But Patricia had started asking questions after the emergency meeting. She'd looked at the financial records and found discrepancies she couldn't explain. "The annual audit is next month," Patricia said, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. Claire's been deflecting questions, changing subjects. I think there's something in those books she doesn't want anyone to see. I asked if she could get me copies of the financial statements. Patricia hesitated, then nodded. "It'll take time. And if she finds out, I lose everything. My home is in that subdivision." I told her I'd protect her identity as long as possible. She left through the back door, disappearing into the darkness like she'd never been there. The power company kept its promise. On the 28th day, a crew arrived and connected my property to the electrical grid. I watched them work, feeling a small measure of victory in every wire they strung. When they finished, I walked inside and flipped the switch. Light flooded the living room, warm and steady, pushing back shadows that had dominated these rooms for too long. I'd won this battle. Claire had tried to keep me in the dark, and I'd fought my way to the light. But the moment didn't last. My phone buzzed with an email notification. When I opened it, the warmth drained from my body. It was a legal summons. Claire Thornton was suing me for illegal trespass and destruction of property. She was seeking $550,000 in damages and a court order forcing me to vacate my own land. The lawsuit was filed in the county court, which meant it'd be public record. The whole town would know by morning. I read the complaint twice, absorbing every fabricated accusation, every twisted interpretation of events. She'd manufactured evidence, weaponized the community, and now she was coming for my property through the legal system itself. I set down my phone and looked around at the newly illuminated room. For weeks, I'd been playing defense, reacting to her moves, trying to survive her attacks. That ended tonight. I walked to the kitchen table where George Hartwell's files were still spread out. where the security footage was backed up on 3 separate drives, and where the operating agreement showing Claire's 17% stake in Horizon Ridge Partners waited to be revealed. She wanted a war in open court. She was going to get one. And she had no idea what ammunition I was bringing. Marcus arrived at the farmhouse the morning after the lawsuit was filed, carrying a leather briefcase and an expression that told me he'd been up all night. We sat at the kitchen table with the legal summons spread between us. The claims were absurd: illegal trespass onto HOA common areas, destruction of community property I'd never touched, harassment of board members. She wants to bury you in legal fees, Marcus said. Force you to spend $60,000 defending yourself. Most people would settle just to make it stop. I asked what our options were. Marcus smiled for the first time since he arrived. We countersue harassment, defamation, tortious interference, and we file a discovery motion demanding every financial record the HOA has produced in the last 12 years. If there's dirt in those books, we're going to find it. The discovery motion was filed 3 days later. Claire's attorneys fought it, arguing that HOA financial records were private documents. But Marcus cited Texas Property Code Section 209, which requires HOAs to maintain transparent records accessible under certain litigation circumstances. The judge sided with us. Within 16 days, the HOA was ordered to produce complete financial statements dating back to 2013. I watched Claire's face on the courtroom video feed when the ruling was announced. For just a moment, her mask slipped. I saw real fear. She knew what was in those documents. The records arrived in 4 banker's boxes. Marcus and I spent a weekend cross-referencing expenses against receipts. The pattern emerged with devastating clarity. Over the past 8 years, the HOA had paid more than $387,000 to Thornton Realty for management consulting services. No contracts. No invoices describing work performed. No board approvals. Just quarterly payments to a company wholly owned by Claire Thornton. The reserve fund, which should have held over $215,000, contained exactly $9,000. Homeowner fees had increased every year, but the money had vanished into Claire's pockets. We'd found the smoking gun, but George Hartwell had found something even more damaging. I returned to his files, searching for anything connecting the embezzlement to the development deal. After 4 days of careful reading, I found it tucked inside a manila envelope labeled Insurance, a side agreement between Claire and Horizon Ridge Partners, dated 19 months before George's death. The terms were explicit. Claire would receive her 17% equity stake only after all 7 privately owned parcels adjacent to Meadowbrook were acquired at prices not exceeding 65% of market value. My farm was Parcel 5. Russell's land was Parcel 3. George's original property was Parcel 1. This was a coordinated scheme to defraud property owners and destroy anyone who resisted. George had discovered the truth, and 4 months later, he was dead. I called the district attorney's office the next morning. When I mentioned the amount of money and the documentary evidence, an appointment was scheduled for the following week. Marcus prepared a formal complaint alleging embezzlement, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and civil conspiracy. Amanda Chen completed her investigative article, confirmed to run the day after the court hearing. The pieces were falling into place. The allies I'd gathered gave me something unexpected: hope. Russell Parker provided an affidavit describing how Claire had harassed him into selling for 40% value. Patricia Monroe submitted a statement explaining how board members signed documents without reading them. But the most surprising development came from Dorothy Williams, a retired teacher who'd kept detailed records of every interaction with Claire over 5 years. Her documentation filled 3 binders. I always knew someone would need this, she told Marcus. I just never thought anyone would fight back. The night before the hearing, I was sitting on the porch watching the sunset when I heard a car approaching. Claire's white Escalade moved slowly down the dirt road and parked 50 feet from the house. She sat there for a long moment before stepping out. When she walked toward me, her hands were shaking. The carefully maintained composure had cracked. "Derek," she said, stopping at the bottom of the steps. "We need to talk." I remained seated. She took a breath. "I'm prepared to withdraw the lawsuit. All of it. You keep your land. I'll file the dismissal tomorrow." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Just stop. Whatever evidence you think you have, just let it go. We can both walk away." I looked at her, remembering the woman who'd stood in the same spot weeks ago, so confident she'd threatened me with a dead man's fate. I remembered George Hartwell spending 4 years fighting for justice. I remembered Russell losing his wife, his land, his peace. I remembered Dorothy and the other families destroyed by this woman. "You asked me once if I wanted to end up like George Hartwell." I said quietly. "Alone? Forgotten. Defeated." Claire's eyes widened. "I've thought about that question, and I finally have an answer." I stood and walked to the edge of the porch. "I'm not going to end up like George, because I'm going to finish what he started." Claire's face went pale. For a moment, I thought she might argue or threaten, but she said nothing. She turned and walked back to her Escalade, shoulders hunched, steps unsteady. I watched her drive away and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just quiet certainty that I was doing the right thing. Tomorrow, I'd walk into that courtroom with enough evidence to end her reign. Tomorrow, Riverside would learn the truth about the woman they'd trusted for 16 years. Tomorrow, George Hartwell's work would finally be complete. I went inside and checked my files one last time. The security footage, the recorded calls, the financial discrepancies, the side agreement with Horizon Ridge. Each piece built upon the last. The first light of dawn was breaking when I closed my laptop. In 13 hours, everything would change. The Riverside County Courthouse was a limestone building from the 1930s with tall windows and oak doors that creaked when they opened. I arrived at 8:42 a.m., 43 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin, and found the parking lot already half full. Word had spread. By the time I walked through the front entrance, the gallery was packed with faces I recognized from town hall meetings and Sunday services, from the diner and the gas station, from every place that had turned its back on me over the past weeks. They'd come to watch the outsider get what he deserved. They had no idea what they were actually about to witness. Marcus met me in the hallway outside the courtroom, his briefcase heavy with documents we'd spent months assembling. "Are you ready?" he asked. I told him I'd been ready since the day Claire Thornton first told me to stop building my fence. The courtroom fell silent when Claire entered with her legal team. She wore a cream-colored suit in pearls, the picture of dignified authority, flanked by 2 attorneys from a Houston firm that charged more per hour than most people in Riverside earned in a day. She took her seat at the plaintiff's table without looking in my direction, her posture rigid, her expression carefully neutral. But I noticed something she couldn't hide. Her hands, clasped tightly on the table in front of her, were trembling almost imperceptibly. The judge was a woman named Barbara Henderson, mid-60s, known for running an efficient courtroom and having little patience for theatrics. She called the proceedings to order at precisely 9:18 a.m. and asked Claire's lead counsel to present the plaintiff's case. The attorney was polished and confident, laying out the accusations with practiced precision. Mr. Hayes had trespassed onto HOA common areas. Mr. Hayes had destroyed community property. Mr. Hayes had harassed board members and disrupted the peace of Meadowbrook Estates. The claims were presented with such conviction that I could see several people in the gallery nodding along, already convinced of my guilt. When the attorney finished, Judge Henderson turned to Marcus. "Counsel for the defense. Your response." Marcus stood slowly, buttoning his jacket with deliberate calm. "Your Honor, before we address the specific allegations, I'd like to establish a foundational fact that the plaintiff has conveniently omitted." He walked to the evidence table and retrieved a certified copy of my deed. Mr. Hayes's property, all 43 acres of it, has never been part of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. There's no covenant, no membership agreement, no legal relationship of any kind between my client and the HOA. The murmuring in the gallery was immediate. Judge Henderson called for order and asked Claire's attorney to respond. The man stood, clearly caught off guard, and attempted to argue that implied consent could be established through geographic proximity. Marcus cut him off. Your Honor, I have here a certified letter from the county recorder's office confirming that the Hartwell property, now owned by Mr. Hayes, has been explicitly excluded from every HOA filing since the association's formation in 2005. The plaintiff has no standing to dictate anything about my client's use of his land. Judge Henderson examined the document and set it aside. Continue. Counselor. Marcus nodded. Furthermore, Your Honor, will demonstrate that the plaintiff's lawsuit is not merely without merit, but is itself part of a pattern of harassment, fraud, and criminal conduct that has victimized residents of this community for over 16 years. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. I watched faces in the gallery transform from smug certainty to confused unease. Marcus began methodically presenting our evidence. First, the security camera footage. The courtroom watched in silence as a figure in dark clothing cut my waterline and kicked over fence posts at 241A M. When the figure turned toward the camera, the Thornton Realty logo was clearly visible on their jacket. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Claire's attorney objected, claiming the footage could have been doctored. Judge Henderson overruled him and asked the plaintiff to explain the presence of her company's employee on the defendant's property in the middle of the night. Claire remained silent. Her attorney requested a brief recess. The judge denied it. Marcus continued. The recorded phone call with the power company's legal department in which an attorney admitted service had been denied based solely on correspondence from the HOA. The financial records showing $387,000 paid to Thornton Realty for services never rendered. The reserve fund that should have contained $215,000 but held only $9,000. With each revelation, the gallery grew more restless. I saw Amanda Chen in the back row, writing furiously, her eyes bright with the knowledge that she had the story of her career. I saw Russell Parker sitting rigid with suppressed emotion, finally witnessing the exposure he'd waited years to see. And I saw Claire, her composure crumbling piece by piece, her expensive attorneys increasingly unable to mount any coherent defense. The side agreement with Horizon Ridge Partners was the final blow. Marcus displayed the document on the courtroom's overhead projector, highlighting the clause that guaranteed Claire a 17% equity stake in a $47 million development project. The condition for receiving that stake was explicit. All 7 privately owned parcels adjacent to Meadowbrook had to be acquired at no more than 65% of market value. This isn't an HOA president protecting her community, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. This is a criminal enterprise designed to enrich one person at the expense of everyone around her. My client's refusal to sell his land threatened to collapse a scheme worth tens of millions of dollars. That's why she filed this lawsuit. That's why she harassed him, defamed him, and turned this entire town against him. Judge Henderson called for a brief recess to review the evidence. When proceedings resumed 23 minutes later, her expression was grave. She asked Claire directly if she wished to respond to the allegations. Claire stood, and for a moment, I saw the woman who'd confronted me at my fence line, the one who'd threatened me with George Hartwell's fate. But something was different. The control she'd maintained for 16 years was slipping away. Your Honor, she began, her voice strained. I've dedicated my life to this community. Everything I've done has been for the good of Meadowbrook. Marcus interjected, including stealing $387,000 from homeowner fees. Claire spun toward him, her composure finally shattering. I built this community. I made it what it is. These people would have nothing without me. Judge Henderson banged her gavel. Mrs. Thornton, you will address the court. Not opposing counsel. But Claire was beyond restraint now. That man has no right to be here. George Hartwell had no right. None of them had any right to stand in my way. The silence that followed was absolute. Claire seemed to realize too late what she'd just admitted. Her attorneys looked stricken. Judge Henderson removed her glasses and set them carefully on the bench. Mrs. Thornton, you've just made statements that I'm obligated to report to the district attorney's office. I'm dismissing your lawsuit against Mr. Hayes in its entirety. Furthermore, I'm granting the defendant's counterclaim and ordering you to pay damages of $75,000 for harassment, defamation, and tortious interference with business relationships. She paused. I'm also referring the financial evidence presented today to the appropriate authorities for criminal investigation. This court is adjourned. What happened next unfolded like a scene from a movie. Sheriff Dale Morrison, who'd been standing quietly near the back of the courtroom, walked forward with 2 deputies. Claire watched them approach with widening eyes, her expensive attorney stepping aside as if distancing themselves from something contagious. Claire Thornton, the sheriff said, his voice formal and clear. You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. You have the right to remain silent. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the silent courtroom. As the deputies led her toward the door, Claire looked back at me with an expression I'll never forget. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was the bewildered disbelief of someone who genuinely believed she was untouchable. Then, she was gone, and the courtroom erupted. People I'd never spoken to approached to shake my hand or apologize for believing the lies. Patricia Monroe pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. I should have spoken up sooner, she said. I'm so sorry. I told her that what mattered was that she'd spoken up at all. Russell Parker gripped my shoulder without words, his eyes saying everything his voice couldn't. Amanda Chen caught my attention from across the room and gave me a nod that promised her story would spare no detail. As I made my way out of the courthouse, Marcus walking beside me with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just won the case of his career. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Russell. George would be proud. By the way, there's one more box in the barn you never opened. He left something for whoever finished what he started. I stepped out into the afternoon sunlight and looked up at the sky. Somewhere, I hoped George Hartwell knew that his fight was finally over. The weeks following Claire's arrest unfolded with a slow, methodical precision of justice finally being served. The district attorney's office moved quickly once they had the evidence, charging Claire Thornton with 3 felony counts: embezzlement of community funds, fraud, and criminal conspiracy to commit theft. Federal authorities became involved when investigators discovered some of the money had been transferred across state lines to accounts in Nevada and Arizona. What started as a local HOA scandal became a case study in how one person's unchecked power could corrupt an entire system. I followed the developments from my farmhouse, reading updates in Amanda Chen's articles, watching occasional news segments when the story made it to regional television. Claire's bail was set at $550,000, which she couldn't post because the court had frozen her assets pending a full forensic audit. For the first time in 16 years, she was experiencing what it felt like to have no power at all. The legal consequences were comprehensive and public. Claire's attorneys attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA rejected their initial offers as insufficient. The evidence was simply too damning. The $387,000 in fraudulent payments to Thornton Realty, the depleted reserve fund, the side agreement with Horizon Ridge Partners proving her personal financial motive, the security footage showing her employee vandalizing my property, and, perhaps most damaging of all, her own words in the courtroom, captured on the official transcript. None of them had any right to stand in my way. In the end, Claire pleaded guilty to all 3 charges in exchange for a reduced sentencing recommendation. The judge gave her 8 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release, plus full restitution of every dollar she'd stolen from the HOA. Her real estate license was permanently revoked. Thornton Realty was dissolved. Its assets liquidated to pay the victims of her schemes. The Horizon Ridge development project collapsed within weeks of Claire's arrest. Without their inside connection to facilitate the land acquisitions, the investors pulled out one by one. The $47 million commercial plaza that was supposed to transform Meadowbrook into a profitable venture died before a single shovel broke ground. I learned later that several of the silent partners had been unaware of Claire's methods, having trusted her assurances that all properties would be acquired through legitimate negotiations. They'd been deceived too, in their own way. But I found it difficult to feel sympathy for people who'd invested millions of dollars without asking how those returns would be generated. The development's failure meant that the land Russell had been forced to sell would remain undeveloped for years, a painful reminder of what he'd lost. But it also meant that Claire's grand plan had failed. She'd destroyed lives for a fortune she'd never receive. The HOA underwent a complete transformation. Patricia Monroe was elected interim president by a unanimous vote of the remaining board members, most of whom were eager to distance themselves from Claire's legacy. An independent audit revealed additional discrepancies beyond what we'd discovered, including falsified meeting minutes and contracts awarded to businesses that didn't exist. 4 other board members resigned when confronted with evidence of their complicity, though none faced criminal charges. The new leadership implemented transparency measures that should have existed from the beginning. Open financial records, recorded meetings, and term limits for all positions. It was a start. Russell Parker, Dorothy Williams, and the other former residents who'd been victimized were invited to participate in a class action lawsuit seeking additional damages. Marcus took the case pro bono, calling it the most satisfying work of his career. The lawsuit would take years to resolve, but, for the first time, the people Claire had hurt had a genuine path to justice. Amanda Chen's investigative series ran for 6 consecutive days in the Riverside County Herald, then was picked up by the regional news network and eventually a national wire service. The articles detailed not just Claire's crimes, but the systemic failures that had allowed them to continue for so long. Regulatory gaps in HOA oversight, the difficulty of challenging entrenched leadership, the way small communities could be manipulated by those willing to exploit social pressure. Amanda was nominated for a state journalism award, and though she didn't win, the recognition brought attention to issues that affected millions of homeowners across the country. She told me later she'd received hundreds of messages from people sharing their own stories of HOA abuse. People who'd felt alone until they learned that someone else had fought back and won. I found the final box 10 days after the trial. Russell had mentioned it in his text message, and I'd been too exhausted by everything that followed to investigate immediately. It was tucked in the back corner of the barn's upper loft, behind a rusted tractor part and a stack of moldy hay bales. The cardboard was water-stained but intact. When I opened it, I found a single envelope resting on top of neatly organized files. The envelope was addressed simply, "To whoever finishes this." I recognized George Hartwell's handwriting from the notes I'd studied for months. I sat down on a hay bale and opened the letter with hands that weren't entirely steady. The words inside were written in a careful, deliberate script. The letters of a man who knew he was running out of time. If you're reading this, then you've done what I couldn't. You've beaten her. I don't know your name, but I know what kind of person you must be. Patient, stubborn, willing to fight for what's right, even when everyone tells you to give up. I started collecting evidence in 2017, 4 years before my heart decided it had had enough. I always knew I wouldn't live to see justice served, but I also knew that someday, someone would buy this land and refuse to be pushed around. Someone who would find what I left behind and understand what it meant. So, I'm writing this letter to thank you. Not just for yourself, but for Russell, for Dorothy, for all the families she destroyed. You gave us something we never had, proof that the truth eventually wins. Take care of this place. It was my home for 34 years, and I hope it'll be yours for many more. Your friend, George Hartwell. I read the letter 4 times before I could put it down. Then I walked outside and looked at the fields stretching toward the horizon. For the first time since I'd arrived in Riverside, I felt like I belonged. 7 months later, the farm was transformed. I'd repaired the barn roof, cleared the overgrown pastures, and installed a proper irrigation system using water rights that had always belonged to the property. The generator was gone, replaced by a reliable connection to the electrical grid that no one would ever threaten again. Russell came by most weekends to help with projects and share stories about the old days. Before Claire. Before the HOA. Before everything went wrong. We planted an orchard together. Apple and peach trees that would take years to bear fruit but would outlast both of us. The fence I'd started building on my first day was finally complete. 4,200 feet of cedar posts and wire marking the boundary between my land and the rest of the world. On the main gatepost, I hung a wooden sign I'd carved myself during the long winter evenings. It read, Hayes Farm, established this year, in memory of George Hartwell. The afternoon I hung that sign, I stood at the gate and looked back at everything I'd built. The farmhouse with its new roof and fresh paint, the barn standing solid against the Texas sky, the fields ready for planting when spring arrived. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the obstacles I'd overcome, the allies I'd found, the woman who'd tried to destroy me and was now paying for her crimes in a federal prison cell. I thought about George Hartwell, who'd fought alone for 4 years and left behind everything I needed to win. And I thought about what this story meant, not just for me, but for everyone who'd ever been bullied by someone with more power and fewer scruples. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to give up. You don't have to let them win. The law is there for a reason. And if you're patient enough, stubborn enough, and brave enough to use it, justice is possible. I closed the gate and walked back toward the house, the setting sun warming my shoulders. Behind me, the sign swayed gently in the evening breeze. George Hartwell's legacy, my new beginning, and proof that the truth eventually always wins. So, let me know your thoughts by dropping a comment below.